everyone, Zach here. Today I'm going to talk through the AAP Containerized installer, which is currently in tech preview, but should be generally available sometime soon in the near future. For this post, I'm going to focus on doing an online installation. So if you've done AAP installations in the past, you'll know there's a difference between like the bundled installer, which is good for offline installations, and then the regular installer, which actually reaches out to online repos to pull down the required packages and image registries to pull down the required containers. So I'm going to focus on the online installer today, and then I'll have a subsequent post where I talk about how you can do this offline. So a few of the requirements here are listed in the blog post. I'm not going to go through those in the video, but what I do want to talk through is some of the features. So the ability to install it as a non-root user. We use rootless Podman for this, and I'm going to really highlight the post-install hook. So I think that's a pretty awesome feature of this installer, is the ability to precede content in your various components of AAP, so your controller, automation hub, and EDA. And in my post, I'm going to do, as my example, a single node installation. I think I'm trying to coin the term snap. I think it's pretty cool for a single node AAP, but just know that you can install this on multiple nodes as well. And later on this year, when AAP 2.5 comes out, the topology may look a little bit different with the gateway coming into play for centralized RBAC. But for now, I think it's still worth getting your hands on, playing with the containerized installer, and then being able to run AAP 2.5 as containers later this year. So let's dive into it. I'm going to hop over to VS Code. And the first thing I want to talk through is the inventory file. If you've done an AAP installation in the past, you know that the inventory file is important. So we've got our similar sections here for our automation controller, automation hub, and automation EDA, as well as I've got commented out here, I don't have an automation mesh in this particular example, but it is supported in one of the later releases of the tech preview containerized installer. And if we scroll down here, there's a database section as well. So for the most part, similar to the traditional installer. You'll notice that I have Ansible connection equals local specified here. This is going to be really important when you're doing the single node installation, and especially when you're running the installer on the particular node that you want. If I was running from, let's say, like a Bastion host and installing it on a separate server, I would want to remove that and just ensure that the FQDN here specified, I can SSH to it and run the installer that way. So in this example, though, I'm running the installer on the host that is going to run the various containers for AAP. So I set Ansible connection equals local. Scroll down to some of my variables. We've got our Postgres variables here. I've got a placeholder here for cancelable. This is just showing you, basically, you should set values here. For me, cancelable is containerized Ansible, but obviously give it a real password. And if I scroll down, you'll see that I actually am showing another way of doing this, which I'm going to go through in a couple minutes, where I've actually vaulted those secrets. So in theory, you'd want all your secrets, including this PostgreSQL admin password, vaulted when you run this setup here. So I've got my registry password coming from a vaulted file. I've got, if I keep scrolling down here, I've got my controller Postgres password, my controller admin password. So all these things are vaulted, which is nice because it keeps things secure, right? So if someone connects to this machine, even if they can open up that secrets.yaml, they won't know what the secrets are, and they can't necessarily look at this inventory and know what those secrets are either. So a couple other things worth highlighting here is I am using custom TLS certs, so that's an option for you as well. Otherwise, the installer will create a self-signed certificate for you. And to do the post install, so for running the post install, there's a couple things you need to set in the inventory. Obviously, this post install flag true is important. The controller license file is also important. So this is actually a feature of this installer. If you've run the installer in the past and gone to AAP for that first time, you actually have to go in and set up your subscription. So with this new feature, I can actually have a manifest locally, and it will bypass that step altogether. And doing that is actually required for the configuration as code piece to work, because if you haven't attached a description yet, the APIs aren't available, so that the post install configuration will fail. I am also using here a Git repository to host my configuration as code files. And I'm pointing at a ref, so I'm pointing at the master branch in this case. You can also do or have these files locally, and that's something I'll show in my offline example, because in an offline, of course, you're not going to be wanting to reach out to something like GitHub. And just know that that's an option for you. And again, if I scroll down, very similar. I'm not going to go through all the sections, but hub would be the same thing, right? I've got my vaulted secrets. I've got my post install set up there. I actually commented out the repo URL because I keep my configuration code for both in the same repo. So since I will have already pulled it down for controller, I can just point to the directory that I know it's going to be in, which I've specified in controller post install directory, and it's going to find the variables needed for me there. Such as something that you can speed things up a little bit. If you have two different repositories for your configuration, you could obviously specify a different configuration there as well. If we keep scrolling down, we'll see we've got our EDA, and that's it. Our execution node section is at the end, but we're not using that today. So one thing I want to walk through really quickly is what does it look like to actually vault secrets. So if I ls here, I'm in the directory with my inventory file. I've got my secrets.yaml file, and if I wanted to view it, which I'm not going to do here because it has some sensitive information, I could do ansible-vault edit secrets.yaml, and it's going to prompt me for a password, so I'm not going to put that in here. But effectively, when I created the vault file, I gave a password, which is what encrypts the file. And when I run the installer in a few minutes, you'll see that I will provide it a password first so that it can access those secret variables during the installation. So what I'll do is I'm just going to give you an example of actually creating a different one. So if I wanted to create one from scratch, I'll call it demo.yaml. So it's going to prompt me for a password, and it'll make me confirm. And then it's just a regular YAML file that it's opening in my default text editor here. So what I would be doing here, if you remember from the inventory, like registry password was a secret that I want to pass through. So I define it in this vaulted file. Let's see, I think Postgres admin password was another one. So I may give it a real value here as opposed to just like cancelable or whatever I was calling it. Again, this is going to be not actually a true good example. But once I've done that, right, I'd fill out all my secrets here, and then I would do a save of the file. I'm working in Vim here. And what happens is it actually vaults it. So if I cat demo.yaml, this means nothing to someone without the vaulted credential. And in AAP, there's actually a vault credential type if you use that in the past, right, which allows you to refer to a variables file in a playbook, and then as long as you provided that vault password, it'll be able to decrypt the file and use the variables themselves. So I can even check this into a Git repo if I want to. I can cat secrets.yaml as well, which is the one that I'm using for my installer, and you'll see that again it's encrypted, so nothing to see there. So you'll see here I'm going to run it as the Ansible playbook because it puts the bash setup script, specifying my inventory, specifying my extra vars coming from a secrets.yaml file, and I'm pointing to the playbook, so it's in a collection called ansible.containerized installer.install, which is actually in the downloaded installer bundle, so you'll have that available to you. And I do specify the AAP pass because otherwise it wouldn't have a password to decrypt my secrets.yaml file. Let me hit enter there. You'll see it's going to ask me for my password. Type it in, and now it's running. So while the installer is running, I want to go ahead and take a look at my configuration as code repo and show you guys what those files look like. So you'll notice here I've got one repo where I have my configuration as code for both components, controller and automation hub. If I had some stuff for EDA as well, I could create a separate folder there. And if I click into one of them, notice I've got a few files here. If I click on one of these files, you'll see that it's basically, you can think of it as just a vars file. So it has variables in it which get parsed as part of the configuration as code collection and leveraged to create resources in your controller. So what I do is I create some controller credentials. I've got my controller admin that's using some variables. I've got Red Hat Automation Hub token, which is using some variables. And I could keep keep going for all these different credentials, and if I click on a different one, job templates, by default it creates these job templates. But like I mentioned, you could have one behemoth file if you really wanted to. What's important is these variable names. So when the configuration as code collection runs, it's keying off of these variables existing, so it knows like, hey, if controller templates is defined, let me loop over this list and create each of these templates. And same thing for the other options here. So labels, controller projects, right? That's how the configuration as code collection works. So where you put these variables doesn't really matter. I like to break them out in files just for cleanliness and readability. But again, it's the variable names that are extremely important here. And then of course the data model that goes within it. You can leverage mine as an example. This is a public repository. You can also go to the infra component name configuration. So in this case, controller configuration documentation. And if you go to their repo, and you go to roles, so for each of the different resource types, there's a role within this collection to create things. So if I want to see what does the data model look like for creating an execution environment, I can click on the execution environment role. I've got this table here with a lot of details, and I like to scroll down to a YAML example, right? So this is a very simple YAML example where I define an execution environment with a name and an image. And if I scroll up, I can actually see the full data model for an execution environment. So I can give it a name, I can give it an image, I can give it a description, I could tie it to an organization, I could tie it to a credential. So this is basically how, if you were going through it and you wanted to learn what are these data models and you're trying to figure everything out and set everything up, definitely do go to the role documentation or the collection documentation and look at the individual roles, and you'll get the options available to you there. So if I come back to VS Code, what I can also show you is the way that I have configured the post install to work, right? So I've downloaded my repository to a controller post install directory, and it's the same for both. So you might be wondering, okay, well, like, how does that work? Because then it's going to be, when it goes through the configuration, it's going to parse all of the files, which is true, because I'm not specifying like /controller or /automation hub, and I don't want to do that because basically it's just going to download the actual repository to the location /controller. So then you're going to have like a duplicate. You'll have controller and then you'll have another /controller. But the reason why it still works just fine is because you notice in those variable names they're prefixed controller execution environment controller templates. Same thing for automation hub. So if I come back over here and I go to my top level and I go to automation hub and I click on, let's say, users, right? We have users and controller too. It would be controller _ users. Here we have automation hub _ users. So you can rest assured that you can have all this in one particular repository. It's the variable names, like I mentioned, that are going to be highly important here. And I've got some example users I'm creating, but just know that you won't conflict if you have that all in the same directory, which I think is not fully obvious when you're looking at the inventory file and some of the examples that are out there, but you'll be fine. So let's see what our progress is on the installation itself. I was not following it. Looks like it's going through and doing some of the configuration as code. And so once that's done, we can actually hop over into the controller, and then also hop over into the automation hub and see those resources having been created in the component itself. And perfect timing, it went ahead and finished up. So what I can do is I can come over here to my Ansible controller, and you'll notice that because these are on a single node, we actually specify the port here. So we have 8443 for controller, 8444 for automation hub, and then 8445 for EDA. And what I just want to show here is that, let's say all these projects were created as configuration as code. So when I first install this instance of controller, I don't have to come in here, add new project, create the source control URL. If I have a credential, I wouldn't have to attach the credential. I can have all that set up as configuration as code. And same thing with users and teams. I could also configure the SAML. So if you're using SAML or SSO, I could have the SAML configuration as part of the configuration as code, so that it's all ready to go when someone comes to log in as well. If I go to templates, I know we had this refresh automation hub. This demo job template is actually created out of the box with AAP. This is the one that I created with the configuration as code, and then I had manually created this one a while back, which is why you didn't see it in the configuration as code. So if I go over to Automation Hub, let me refresh this, re-log in here. We can see, let's go, since we did users as an example, let's go back to users. You'll see I've got my different Astros users, and they're part of their various groups, right? So we know now the configuration as code worked. There's a lot you can do with this. I think it's really powerful. The last thing I want to show is if I come back to the node that I installed Ansible on, is if I do a Podman PS, and I'm actually going to leverage, if I go back to my post, I've got a nice command you can run, and I always forget the exact command, to format the output just to make it a little bit more consumable for us. So here you can see these are all of the containers running. So all the different components. We've got controller, we've got our EDA activation worker and API and UI, and same with hub. So I think that's pretty cool, right? We can actually see, we got our Postgres as well, and Receptor, and then Redis. And they're all running on the same node in this case. So if you'd installed it on multiple nodes, you would be able to connect to those other nodes and run the same command. And like, let's say I was connecting to the node that I ran controller on, I'd have the controller containers plus maybe Postgres or Redis, depending on what's installed there. And same thing with the other nodes as well. So I hope that was worthwhile for you to kind of walk through. I encourage you to set it up and run it yourself and really get some of that config as code going. I think it's really powerful for like development sandbox environments. Definitely powerful. Things like PCN or DMZ networks where you want to run AAP and you want to be able to spin it up really quickly and be ready to go. I think it's a really powerful way to do it. And if you're interested in more of the offline installation, stay tuned, and I'll be posting a blog where I go through some of the parameters that you can leverage, which are really beneficial for an offline scenario. Thanks for listening. As always, drop a note in the comments if you have any questions.